The Nature of Perspective, Chapter 1 in Symbolic Interaction is an introduction, an interpretation, and integration, 10th edition, by Joel M. Charon. First, we'll start with the definition of perspective. The definition of perspective is an angle on reality, a place where the individual stands as he, she, Z looks at and tries to understand reality. If you haven't heard the term Z before, it is one of the many terms that can be used to include gender fluid people into the discussion. An angle will always limit what one sees, since other angles, many of which may also be accurate, cannot be considered at the same time. Examples of differing perspectives and how they fit the definition. So, the point of view story in this chapter illustrates how different actors, all involved in the same situation, are limited by the angles that they have on the situation. Each person has a very different understanding of what transpired. So the wife has a different understanding of what was going on than does the husband, than does the would-be robber, who is actually somebody just asking for a light for a cigarette, and that differs from what the police account of the story was. I found this poem, which is based on a Indian parable, a very old Indian parable. It's called "The Blind Men and the Elephant" by John Godfrey Saxe. And I'm going to go ahead and read this. "It was 6 men of Indostan to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, 'God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall!' The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, 'Ho! what have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp, to me 'tis mighty clear, this wonder of an elephant is very like a spear.' The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, he thus up and boldly spake, 'I see,' quoth he, 'the elephant is very like a snake.' The fourth reached out an eager hand, and felt about the knee, 'What most this wondrous beast is like is mighty plain,' quoth he, ''tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree.' The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, 'E'en the blindest man can tell what this resembles most, deny the fact who can, this marvel of an elephant is very like a fan.' The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, than seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, 'I see,' quoth he, 'the elephant is very like a rope.' And so these men of Indostan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong." So this poem, the parable, demonstrates the nature of perspective and how our angle on reality limits our ability to see the whole truth of any situation. In the video that I'm having you watch this week, Michael Patrick Lynch talks about whether or not there is any sort of objective reality that we can all agree upon. And he says, we can all agree on certain things, that bullets kill people, that we can't flap our wings and fly. So there is possible some objective reality. And in this case, that objective reality is the elephant. The elephant is the objective reality. And each of these men that are touching different parts of the element is an angle on that shared reality. So continuing here, additionally, this parable illustrates how our commitment to our belief that our angle on reality is the accurate one makes us unable to consider the perspectives of others, whose angles may help us develop a clearer picture of what's going on. We say certain things are common sense. It is common sense, well, I'm touching this, I'm touching this is clearly like a tree, I'm touching this is my experience of it, so that's common sense. but you don't have the same experience as the next person. It's not common sense to the person next to you who's touching the ear that, your experience is that it's a tree. And that's how it is in life. Uh, we say certain things are common sense. It's common sense. I grew up in the suburbs, like 98% white suburb of Detroit. And to me, and to many other people who grew up in such an area where we didn't have any diversity or very little diversity, to me it was clear I couldn't see racism. I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it because there weren't people who were a different race than me to be able to see it. There was nothing to see. And so I didn't think racism existed. And as a consequence of me not believing racism existed, that was my perspective, and that defined how I thought the world worked. So what was common sense to me was that the reason why there weren't any African Americans living in my city was because they didn't want to. I didn't know anything about redlining. I had no idea. That didn't even make sense to me that would even be a thing. Today, when I was in school, that was like in the 80s and the 90s. The civil rights movement was back in the 60s. Surely we had overcome that, in the civil rights movement. So it was that they didn't want to live there. That's what I thought. That was my angle on reality. That was common sense to me. And indeed, that was common sense to a great number of people who lived in those kind of communities. As a result of our angle on reality and our belief that our angle on reality is accurate, we are unable to consider the perspectives of others whose angles may help us to develop a clearer picture of what's going on. Had there been more diversity in Sterling Heights, then it's very possible then the sharing of their experiences may have informed ours and broadened ours and made us realize that maybe ours weren't correct. But we didn't have that opportunity. We were stuck on our part of the elephant. This is a little disclaimer here. To be sure, today we understand that physically blind people would not have any problem determining that they were touching an elephant. I think that goes without saying, but I want to put that in there. This blindness in this story refers to a psychological blindness rather than a physical one. It's an unwillingness rather than an inability. And I need to make that clear. Okay. The nature of perspective. So as illustrated in The Blind Man and the Elephant, an angle always limits what one sees, since other angles, many of which may also be accurate, cannot be considered at the same time. Human beings always see reality through perspectives. There is no possible way that any individual can see all aspects of any situation simultaneously. In fact, the very nature of perspective forces us to pull out certain stimuli from our environment and to totally ignore other stimuli. And then perspectives force us to make sense out of those stimuli that we are focusing on at the expense of others. So that explains why each person touching the elephant was convinced, the stimuli that they had in front of them is what they were touching. And they ignored there being any possibility beyond that. And we do that too. In my example with the lack of diversity in Sterling Heights, we only focused on our experience. Well, we didn't experience racism. We didn't see it. So therefore, it didn't happen. There are other experiences out there. And if we had deliberately wanted to broaden our perspectives, it wouldn't have been too hard to go find those examples. But we were ignoring it, so we stuck with what we knew. Perspectives sensitize the individual to see some parts of reality and desensitize them from seeing other parts. And although we cannot see outside our perspectives, this does not mean it is impossible to expand our perspectives or angles on reality through new experiences of reality. change and broaden our perspectives. So, a few of you mentioned in your hopes and fears post that you would like to broaden your perspectives. How exactly do we do that? So, what would have happened if one of the men touching a part of the elephant would have shifted over and touched a different part, having moved from the ear to the trunk or the tail to a leg? Would he have been able to maintain that his angle on the reality of what he was touching was correct? Or would he, as a result of this new experience, necessarily have to shift his perspective accordingly? How do new experiences produce new understandings of reality? Many times going to college is, and this is something that Charon states in the text, is it necessarily forces us to consider alternate explanations and alternate perspectives. In fact, he says, sociology is one perspective. Each other discipline that we study is yet another perspective on reality. Okay, different experiences that we have are going to lead to different perspectives. I think you're probably all starting to get the point now. If you haven't already, it's coming into focus. Okay, so we've got people who live in a small town are going to have very different life experiences than those who live in a large city. For example, there is a norm of public privacy that you have when you live in a big city. And sometimes people who go from a small city to a larger one don't understand why something like that needs to be in place. But when you live in a place where there are so many people, like New York, Chicago, those big cities, you have to be able to have privacy in public because you're always around people. And so, you get those stereotypes of New Yorkers being unfriendly, because they're all walking down the street just kind of minding their own business, being private in a sea of people. And that is not an experience that somebody from a small town would be familiar with, because they're not always surrounded by people. There's just less people. People aren't on top of each other. So the perspective on, how one should behave in public is going to be different. There's a certain friendliness that is required when you live in a small town and everybody knows everybody. There's no anonymity, and that's a very different experience than somebody from the city would have. Okay, females are going to have vastly different perspectives on life than males are as a result of their experiences. Cisgendered people, or people whose gender, their experienced gender, matches their biological sex, are going to have very different experiences in life from gender fluid or transgender people. And then I've got a whole list here, and you can just kind of go down and read it, some of the different life experiences, and I'd like you to think about how these different experiences are going to lead to different perspectives. Perspectives often apply to and impact more than one role we hold. So, as a female, I have a certain perspective which impacts my role as a teacher, as a voter, as a parent, and as a spouse. Your perspectives as students are going to impact your roles as workers, as voters, as parents, if applicable, as offspring, etc. Hopefully, those of you who have taken Intro to Sociology will remember the term role taking the role of the other. So once we are willing to see reality from another's perspective, we are able to then take the role of the other, to role take with that person, to step into their shoes and to be able to see from their perspective. And role taking, if you recall, is an essential component of the development of the self, and it is a core concept in symbolic interactionism. So it is how we learn to see ourselves as others sees us, to think of ourselves as an object of somebody else's experience. And that's when the self develops, is once we're able to do that. Okay, some other important points about perspectives. Perspectives are inherently biased. We can attempt to eliminate bias as much as possible, and in social research we make every effort to do this, but we can never eliminate it entirely. The best we can do is to become deeply aware of our biases so that we can reduce their influence on our decisions, on our behavior, on our research. Our opinions are always the result of our perspectives, always, always, always. Perspectives determine what decisions we make, whether to stay or evacuate before a hurricane. Why would people stick around? Why would people take that chance? Well, in many cases, this latest hurricane flooded like completely. Well, first of all, 51.88 inches is almost unfathomable in terms of the amount of rain that this storm was dumping on Texas. So it's hard to even wrap our brains around how much rain that is. I mean, that's more than they usually get in a year, and they got it in a couple of days. So um, people's experiences or people's perspectives were limited by their experience. None of them had experienced anywhere close to that amount of rain before. So there was that. Another thing was that many of the areas that flooded in the storms were areas that had been previously unaffected by other hurricanes that had hit that same area of Texas. So a lot of people thought they were safe. Also, um, Hurricane Rita hit Texas shortly after Hurricane Katrina had hit uh, New Orleans, like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Um, and we all saw the devastation that occurred as a result of Hurricane Katrina, which by comparison dumped 18 inches of rain instead of 51.88 inches of rain. So people had learned their lesson, and so when the predictions were being made that Rita was going to be a really bad storm and that Rita was going to hit, Texas and Louisiana, everybody wanted to get out of there because nobody wanted what happened to um, people in Katrina to happen to them. So there was a lot of gridlock as people were trying to evacuate, and people were trapped and stuck um, without food, without water on the freeways. And there were many people that died as a result of that gridlock. So a lot of people were saying, they were hedging their bets and saying, well, look at what happened during Rita, and since my area has previously been unaffected by hurricanes, I'm going to take my chances and I'm going to stay because I think it's safer for me to stay than to try to go. So our perspective, without knowing any of those things, might be that it's foolish for them to stay. Why would they risk staying? But we aren't seeing things from their angle on reality. We haven't been through what they've been through. Um, so we have to keep that in mind. And that's just one example of how this happens. This is true. We can apply this to just about anything. Perspectives always emerge out of social interaction. They are socially created, maintained, and challenged. They never occur in isolation. Perspectives are always the result of how we define the situation in the present, which is the Thomas theorem. If some of you recall from your intro classes, situations that are perceived to be real are real in their consequences. That is the Thomas theorem. And that basically means that what we believe to be true about a given situation is going to affect our actions that we take as a result of it, regardless of whether or not our perception is an accurate one. So if we believe that immigrants are a threat to our well-being in this country, then we might support actions like building a wall to keep them out, regardless of whether or not that perception is an accurate one. So situations that are perceived to be real are real in their consequences. The Thomas theorem is how propaganda functions. Like it's based in the Thomas theorem. It's getting people to believe something true about a situation so that they take certain actions or are willing for the government to take certain actions. That's the Thomas theorem in a nutshell. And that's its connection to perspectives. Perspectives that are informed by our past but change only in the present. It is how the fictional criminal in the example in the Charon text uses his present perspective on his mother's abandonment of him to define his present situation. It is as a result of his present present definition of the situation of having been abandoned by his mother in the past that he then makes the decision to take a particular action in the present. Okay, it's this thing that happened a long time ago. And it is how he chooses to define that today that leads to the decision that he takes, the criminal behavior that he undertakes. It's his definition of the situation today. If his definition of the situation were to change today, then he might not decide to take that action. But the thing in the past never changes. And the important thing to know is that it isn't the thing in the past that caused him to make the decision that he did, because he could have a number of different definitions of that situation that could lead him to guide him to take a number of different actions. It is his definition of the situation. It is his definition of that abandonment that leads him to decide to be a criminal and to do this criminal thing. So things in our past do not cause us to do anything. It is our definition of things that happened in the past, in the present, that then impact our choices. And if anybody is still not clear on that, please contact me, because that is one thing that we definitely want to get clear. Okay, so we've covered this. We've covered Charon. I'm also wanting you to read and take a look at the lecture on Aronson, and to do the other assignments that are assigned for this week, obviously. If anybody has any questions, if anything is not clear in this lecture, please consider making that a post for your questions and discussions forum, and I will be happy to clear those things up for you. So that's all for this one.